I saw you. I didn't listen.
I'm just amazed.
I took
Like there's lines, some of their African music. The whole place is awful.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I put it away, and now I'm gonna have more people, so I'm gonna go, okay.
Yeah.
A year or so, she and I were
Yeah.
so we got
All right, I will more likely be down on roll. If you need to, I'll check myself. All right, Graham, thank you.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Good morning.
We don't see everything is going.
Hello.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all really well, I have slightly less
You think it's a little out of date? But it's only the bookcase.
I was there for 20 minutes.
yeah.
We had some Saudi last night. Yeah. Pretty good, man. Yeah. There's not a lot of good, there's not a lot of good Chinese food in Charlotte. Like the best Chinese food we have is Harvard. Chapel Hill. Yeah, it's always yeah, for like I lived in China for about 4 or 5 years, so it's different American. Like spices. Very different. It's too sweet. Yeah. Chinese Kentucky fried chicken has spicy chicken.
I did it 4 years in China.
You did, yeah, the first time.
Did you teach us?
I did, yeah. So I led the David China program.
Well, I had a chance to teach Japanese at the States for 9 people.
The judge.
Yes, and I enjoyed it. Excellent.
It's great, yeah. But when I was in college, I studied Chinese. Yeah, most of my classmates from Japan.
2 more.
Are studying Chinese. Wow.
One of them is they said you guys should teach Chinese because China is the library, you know, because it took longer than I expected.
Yeah.
But it's real now, you know.
It does, yeah. It's on break right now. So well, I'm one of our Chinese language teachers. Yeah, summer. So
all the challenges process. Because you know, like the college and all the, transportations. That is just amazing.
God help me to
Oh, so they're available.
That's correct. So now we're back. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I am John Ryan gave me two tasks this morning in addition to welcoming Dr. Bullock. One is to remind us all that we are being live streamed on YouTube, and that the video of that will remain on the church's YouTube page if you want to watch that later. And then the second thing was he asked me, said we should open with a prayer. So if you would pray with me for a moment. Gracious and eternal God, we are grateful for opportunities for lifelong learning. May we ever be mindful of what our faith requires of us. May we ever be mindful of the commitments we have made as a church. We are bold to pray because Jesus Christ is Lord. Amen. So I am very pleased. Welcome back to the Covenant class, Dr. Graham Bullock, for the first of two sessions on justice, kindness, and humility, the challenges and possibilities of divine citizenship. Dr. Bullock is an associate professor of political science at Davidson College. He is the faculty director of the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative and the director of the Davidson in China program. He grew up in Washington, D.C., holds a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from the University of California at Berkeley, a master in public policy from the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, and an undergraduate degree in ecology and evolutionary biology with a 5-year certificate in East Asian Studies from Princeton University. So, Dr. Bullock, thank you, and turn on your mic.
Okay, well, welcome on. Thank you for having me here today. It's quite an honor to be with you here both in person and with our friends online. Today I'm going to share my screen for our friends online as well. Let me do that. Okay, can you all see that? Okay, so you got the title. Let me see if I can. Oh, there's this little thing. Yeah, so justice, kindness, and humility, the challenges and possibilities of deliberative citizenship. So sometimes kindness is translated as mercy. We can sort of think about the distinctions there. So today, so we have two sessions together. Today, I'm going to focus mostly on the challenges of deliberative citizenship. and the sort of the conceptual what and why of it. Next time, we'll talk more about the possibilities and the how, the sort of the technical how of deliberative citizenship. But today we'll kind of set things up for that. Okay, so we're going to start with Micah. This is a representation of Micah. And the book of Micah begins with Micah being very upset and representing God's, how do you say, anger with the situation in Israel. It says a lament for Samaria and Jerusalem. I'm going to start with reading this lament. Hear this, all you nations. Listen to this, all who live on earth. The sovereign Lord will testify against you. Listen, he speaks from his heavenly temple. The Lord is coming from his holy place. He will come down and walk on the tops of the mountains. Then the mountains will melt under him like wax in a fire. They will pour down into the valleys like water pouring down a hill. And then he goes on to describe how the people of Israel have sinned and rebelled against God, and particularly the people of Samaria and Jerusalem, the capitals of Israel and Judah. And later he talks about how in Micah 3:2, listen, you rulers of Israel, you are supposed to be concerned about justice, yet you hate what is good and you love what is evil. And he has some kind of descriptive language here about how bad these leaders are, and he's also upset with the prophets, with the sort of religious leaders of the society. But this is directed towards, I think, the rulers, that you skin my people alive and tear the flesh off their bones. You eat my people up. You strip off their skin, break their bones, and chop them up like meat for the pot. The time is coming when you will cry out to the Lord, but he will not answer you. So, and just some context, right? So Micah is, and so my amateur biblical reading, is that he's a contemporary of Isaiah at the time, but Isaiah is an intellectual. He's in the city, and Micah is more, from small towns, but he has a similar kind of very, how do you say, reflecting an anger, a frustration with the state of things in society. And the Assyrians are coming. He sort of forecasts the fall, of both capitals. And so, what is the core issue that Micah is concerned about? He states it pretty clear. It's sort of not worshiping God, a concern about idolatry. Uses that term specifically, and kind of more broadly, a sort of selfishness, a not caring about others. And I think that this is a long time ago, right? Hundreds of years ago. But maybe it resonates a little bit, with how some of us are feeling about our current society. A sense of frustration with a variety of forms of idolatry, political idolatry, secular or market idolatry, tribal or identity idolatry, all sort of forms of connection that put sort of the self or one's own sort of group above the sort of concerns of God and the broader society, not caring about others. We can translate this, roughly, to in sort of modern terms, to a concern about citizenship. And let's see if I can. What is citizenship? So there's a lot of dictionary definitions that I won't go into, but for me, the fundamental definition, fundamental understanding of citizenship is this definition right here. Citizenship is the work people do together to solve the challenges that face society, that bring us together beyond our sort of individual identities, which are really important, critical, but help us think to transcend those identities. What do we need to do together to face and solve these larger challenges we have? And I like this sort of metaphor. I talk with my students quite a bit about different metaphors, different ways of thinking about citizenship, and have them kind of draw pictures, like the citizenship tree, for example, or the citizenship bicycle. But one of my favorites is the idea of a citizenship. So we're all on a ship together, right? We have to figure out where we want to go, and then we have to get there. We have to work together to get there, to sail that ship. So this comes to our next concept, or thinking about deliberation, right, or deliberative citizenship. Now, it's not deliberate, although it is also deliberate, but it's deliberative citizenship. And that kind of encourages us to sort of think about what is deliberation. And here's a definition for us: a structured form of discourse focused on building both shared and new understandings of a particular issue that transcend previously held positions and enable collective decisions and actions. Okay, so that's kind of a mouthful. So I've got a way to sort of understand deliberation in the context of other forms of discourse. Right? Discourse is just communication, right? Connecting with others. And it's kind of this metaphor of a landscape when you're having starting with a basic conversation, right? You're just talking with your friends, your random conversation, jumping around to different topics, how's the weather, what happened in the election, whatever, et cetera, jumping around a lot. That's conversation. Then discussion is another form of discourse where you're kind of focused in on a particular issue. Now let's talk a little more specifically about a topic like the election, right? And then you start mapping out things on this landscape, different positions about that topic, right? Also an important form of discourse. Then, we might dig deeper. We might try to understand why we hold these positions, why different people hold these positions. We mine down into the assumptions, the life experiences through a process of dialogue, of listening, of seeking to understand. It's very important, right? Then we might start, once we have that understanding, we might actually start debating, assessing, evaluating those different assumptions, those different experiences, the different facts that, are the base of those positions, right? And doesn't have to be in a sort of competitive, negative sense of debate, right? More in a positive sense of just, evaluation, right? What's right? We're trying to get the truth here. And that's also an important form of discourse. But then that's not yet deliberation, right? Deliberation is then we think broadly, we've done this conversation, discourse, dialogue, debate. Then what do we do with that, right? Rather than going home and say, you won the debate, you lost the debate. No, we try to transcend where we were, and we come up with new ideas, new positions, new policy ideas that maybe everybody can get behind and transcend what we started with in the conversation. And so I use this sort of metaphor of monopoly, right? So we start out talking about, houses, right? We can all build this kind of house, this kind of house. Then suddenly no, wait, let's do something different. Let's build a hotel, right? Something very, very different, right? And maybe, no, let's not even build it. Let's play a different game, right? Let's play Clue. Let's play Sorry. Let's go outside, right? Thinking outside the box, the Monopoly box, so to speak, right? So that's what deliberation can do. It's connected to all these other forms of discourse, but it is distinct. And so then we move to sort of back to citizenship. What's deliberative citizenship? Simply citizens who are doing this work. They're doing deliberation in the expression and the act of being good citizens. Then we can sort of kind of, and to note critically, it's not mutually exclusive from other forms of citizenship. Voting, protesting, volunteering, donating, all those are also really important forms of citizenship, and they can and should complement each other. But not having deliberation, not being a deliberative citizen, also sort of suggests that we aren't being fully good citizens. We're not engaging with our fellow citizens on what we should do. And this brings us to this concept of deliberative democracy. And essentially, basically, it's that sort of idea of deliberation in aggregate, right, across many scales and contexts. So it kind of takes the sort of idea of deliberation that I just explained and sort of codifies, suggests certain principles. The first is one of reason giving, right? You're in conversation with your fellow citizens, you're coming from different perspectives. The requirement of just providing reasons, not just because I say so, or because a particular book says so, or personage says so. You have to give good reasons that I can understand, that are accessible. They're not in a language I don't understand. They're not so technical or connected to a particular secular or faith tradition that I can't understand it if I'm not part of that tradition. And it comes to a decision, right? It's not just talk, right? It's coming to some binding decision. But that decision is dynamic. We can revisit it over time in the future. And then it suggests, why is this important? What are the sort of purposes of deliberation? Well, first, it encourages this public-spirited perspective that I was just mentioning, that instead of focusing on our individual self-interests, which are important, critical, it helps us think beyond ourselves, right, into the broader community. It promotes the legitimacy of collective decisions. So even if I lose, I don't get everything I want, I trust this process, and I trust the other people in the process because I understand where they come from. I've seen that they are listening to me, and they listened. They might not have agreed with me, but they at least processed and engaged with my reasons. And it promotes a mutually respectful process of decision making. It's not just using power to make decisions. It's trying to be, we say, deliberative, to be reasonable. And then finally, that dynamic nature helps us correct mistakes, right? That we make a decision, but then we can revisit it. And there's a process embedded in this whole concept of deliberative democracy that enables that. So here's kind of a definition, again, of deliberative democracy: a form of decision-making in which decisions are the product of fair and reasonable discussion and debate among citizens. You notice, first of all, like that can be among citizens, right? Among us. It can also be, at a policymaker level as well. And we can think of deliberative democracy in multiple ways, multiple lenses. One is it's a sort of school of thought. There's a whole literature and field on this topic. It's a type of governance. It's an empirical claim, like that we actually are doing this, at least in some areas of society. And it's an aspirational goal that we maybe are not doing it as much as we want, but we're trying to do more, and we're trying to seek out how to do more. And just to this point, that this, the sort of multiple scales of deliberative democracy, there's that deliberation among us as citizens. There's deliberation among policymakers at a, national, state, Count of Davidson level. And then there's deliberation between policymakers and citizens, where we're talking to each other, town halls, et cetera, and actually talking to each other, not just at each other. So this is another concept from Scott Aiken and Robert Talese. Deliberative doctrine has this dialectical view of argument. We think of argument often as a bad thing, something to stop and stay away from. They see it as actually good and foundational to democracy. Argument is an attempt to rationally resolve a disagreement and answer critical questions. Democracy is the social and political arrangement that allows us to pursue the cognitive goal of collectively living together according to our best reasons. So why is deliberative democracy important? So there's schools of thought on this, right? So some is it's intrinsically good, right? That we do this work, that it's a good in of itself to engage with our fellow citizens, to show respect to them, to be open-minded and be humble about our own, sort of abilities to be wrong. And then there's also extrinsic reasons that this is instrumentally important, that it helps us get to better outcomes in society. It helps us avoid real problems, conflict, civil war, et cetera, because we have that process of building legitimacy of our decision-making processes. The losers don't feel like they've really lost permanently, because if they do, then they may resort to other means of beyond politics. And then it also speaks to, so there's a push and pull, there's a pro and con there. It's like it avoids problems, but it also helps us do the best, the wisdom of the crowds idea, right? Then there's sort of the limitations of what theorists call aggregative democracy. What is aggregative democracy? It's this picture right here, voting, right? So a classically liberal concept. We come in and we have our interests, we have our positions. They're sort of, how do you say, outside the system, exogenous, as they say. It's not influenced by anything else. We just come in and vote and we're done. And that's very different than a deliberative sentiment, or what it's a civic Republican sentiment, that actually, no, we come in and our preferences, our interests, our values can be influenced by one another. In conversation, you learn new things. You say, wow, like I didn't even think of it that way before. And your vote may actually change through that process. And so they're not, again, mutually exclusive. Remember, deliberative democracy has a binding decision, and often that binding decision comes from a vote. But it doesn't start with the vote. It doesn't sort of preclude that conversation. And by doing that, by the limitations of that, is that you don't allow that conversation. You don't allow that avoidance of conflict later down the road, and missing out on transcendent ideas that come out of that process, that hotel, as opposed to all our little greenhouses. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now I'm going to ask you guys a question, right? So if you're like me, and like many people who hear all this, sounds great, Dr. Bullock, but it's very idealistic, right? It's very, pie in the sky. And you're probably going to think all the sort of like challenges. And yes, it's hard. Turbulent seas, that it's not always smooth sailing in terms of doing deliberation. So I'm curious to hear what you all are thinking about this. What are some of these difficulties in terms of doing this work? And I think I have one. Yeah, so there's kind of two sets of challenges that we can be thinking about. So the challenges that deliberative democracy and deliberative citizenship are trying to solve in society. Those can also be challenges to deliberative democracy. But then there's also challenges intrinsic to this project of deliberative democracy and deliberative citizenship. So what do you all think? And I'm going to try to sort of write these up on the board here for everyone, and for everyone to see. Maybe I'll stop my sharing so that people can see what I'm doing here. So what are some challenges that come to mind? So this is us over here. And this is this kind of like, sitting on a hill, like, sort of deliberative democracy over here. And we can think of, the sort of policymaker level, and then just, citizens, us, people. And I use, by the way, I use not in the sort of sense of like what passport you hold or what country you're from, but in a sense, again, of that project. We're all in this effort to solve our problems. More kind of in that vein of like global citizenship. We're all global citizens. We have lots of problems, but local level, international level, we're all sort of working to improve our situation. So what are some obstacles that kind of get in the way of getting there? So, yeah.
Seems to be an issue with defining what a fact is.
Yeah.
Certainly, no clear evidence of what evidence is.
Right. Okay, good. What else? Yes.
When you play a game, you have a set of rules that everybody essentially agrees to play by.
Mhm.
And in this game, I'm not sure that anybody set the rules or anybody agreed to play by.
Mhm. Mhm. And I'm putting some of these like in the middle of our picture, right? Because they're sort of relevant to both the local micro level as well as the macro. Yeah, good. I saw a hand over here. Yeah.
I was going to say fear of overcoming status quo.
Okay. Fear of, can you say a little more? Fear of overcoming status quo.
Well, I think if you hold a position of comfort in the status quo,
Mhm.
then you may have fear of that being changed.
Okay, so I hear two things, right? So one is fear, right? So fear generally, I want to get that up there, because, and then kind of status quo. We often call political science status quo bias, right? Not wanting to lose our power or status from the status quo. Okay.
Professor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Bill Cockrell online.
Yes. Good. I see your hand up. Jump in there, Bill.
One thing is how understanding ourselves as citizens versus understanding ourselves as taxpayers, and emphasizes in recent decades we have tended toward the latter rather than the former, but it affects how we go about all of this and what our main interest is.
Okay, good. So I think, just to project what you're saying, Bill, so orientation towards particular identities, and you're particularly highlighting our taxpayer identity, but there may be others as well, right, that are not our role as citizens, our identity as citizens in that sense. Other ideas, yeah?
It seems to me this might come under the rules of the game, but we're not able to use reason and be rational. I don't know how that fits in exactly, but it seems to me that we've lost that.
Okay. Can you say more? What do you, that's great. So what do you mean by like not able to use reason?
Well, I think there are circumstances where you try to express the facts, be reasonable that way,
Mm-hmm.
when the person you're deliberating with is not, does not follow reason.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm going to just put this up here. So difficulty of reasoning.
It's kind of not following the same rules.
Okay, so there's a kind of connection there. Maybe it's also connected to facts, evidence, right? Good, yeah. So and it may be like I'm going to add to what you said. So our ability, our sense of our ability to reason well, like we might get upset and emotional and or just don't feel competent, right, to to express a complex set of reasons. And then our interlocutors may also not be responsive to when we do that, right? Good. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I think there can be different levels of commitment with the deliberative process. Sometimes someone taking part in this just wants to win at all costs, rather than to hear anyone else out and to engage in deliberation.
Good, good. Yeah. So I'm going to squeeze that one in here. Different levels of commitment. Even if the rules are clear, you still may not be fully, everybody may not be fully committed. Yes.
Sometimes we just don't listen.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's sort of up here, right? Sort of like not listening. My idea of organizing.
I don't want to hear an opposing view.
Yeah. Right. And that feeds into this, right? And, you know, maybe that goes up there. Yeah. What else? What are some other challenges? Yeah. Yeah. So say more. What
goes into not listening sometimes.
Yeah. So it could be something about levels of commitment, right? So valuing the process. It could also be more fundamental, right? That, you know, sort of emphasizing liberty and freedom, you know, over here, and then emphasizing, say, equality, you know, over there, and seeing them as, you know, sort of distinct and not connected, right? So running out of space, I'm going to add some over here. That might lead to that.
Inequality would be.
Good, good. See that? Yeah. So say a little more. So how would inequality be?
Housing situation, you know, the community is trying to solve housing.
Mhm.
Got people representing different parts of the community, different economic backgrounds, different work background, and different needs. It would seem to me to be a problem or
Yeah.
difficulty in bringing everybody together.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So inequalities, and that can often lead to sort of power differentials, right? I think you're getting at that, right? You know, and that is, you know, outside of the deliberative context, very, very evident. But it can affect the deliberative context, right? So who is going to be in the conversation? Is it truly inclusive, right? Representing different voices? And then also, once the conversation happens, how are the dynamics, right? Do powerful overwhelm, right? Did they sort of translate their power from outside the deliberative context and then just replicate it in the conversation, in the deliberation? That also is a challenge, right? Good. What else? What are some other? Yeah, Pam.
Too much emphasis on the houses and the decisions. To get into the process and think that I have to make a decision, then I've got to be right and you've got to be wrong, rather than even imagining there could be a hotel. There could be something outside the box, but until we get to that point, there's something bigger that involves us all or incorporates us all that's outside the box. We need so much time to understand all those other things that are going into play. I don't know how to say that, but I think.
Yeah.
Switching paradigms.
Yeah, so I think it's connected to this one down here, sort of orientation towards particular identities and positions, right? And then a lack of kind of creative thinking in a sense, right?
There's a lack of creative thinking, and you can't get to creative thinking until you have everything out on the table.
Right.
Without, well, what's the decision that we've got to make? I think that sometimes there's not enough emphasis on the process and too much on the decision.
Right. Right. And impatience to get to a decision. Yeah. Right. And not going through that mapping, that discussion and dialogue and debate process. Good, yeah. And try and coming to sort of a false consensus in a sense, right? Other thoughts? Okay, so there's a big category that we haven't talked about, which is particularly when we're talking about democracy and this sort of macro stuff that I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I think it's worth highlighting is structural issues, right? Structural, the way our elections are designed, our party system, right, creates sort of incentives and disincentives, mostly disincentives for this kind of work at that level. I'm going to go back through a couple slides to sort of highlight a few more challenges. You mentioned a lot, and I think there's some overlap, but just to get us on the same page. Uh-oh. Okay, so some general challenges. These are a mix of things, right? So these are challenges that deliberative democracy is trying to engage with and resolve. They're also challenges to deliberative democracy. Hyperpolarization, hyperpartisanship, lack of engagement with different viewpoints. We sort of talked about that. Missed opportunities to connect with one another. Dehumanization of the other. Idea and policy stagnation. I think this is kind of what Pam was getting at. Disinformation and misinformation, sort of this concern about facts, right, up here. So some general challenges, and then some contemporary challenges. At the level of the individual, of us, our psychology, this idea of sort of type 1 versus type 2 thinking. So type 1 is this thinking like really fast and intuition. You just make a choice really fast. The idea of an elephant, our internal elephants. It's very important, very valuable way of thinking, but it can lead us in the wrong direction. Type 2 is that very conscious frontal cortex like decision making. It sort of weighs those reasons, but often it's a rider on the elephant and doesn't always control it. Motivated reasoning, confirmation bias. We've got our ideas, and we try to sort of orient every new piece of information in our framework to avoid cognitive dissonance, in a sense. There's also rhetorical challenges. The language, the words, the phrases we use and don't use. So there's a book called the Scout Mindset, where author talks about how we use battle and war sort of metaphors in our language, that reflect, this sort of, I'm going to poke a hole in your argument, right? Like, why you want to poke a hole, so it's reflecting a sort of, aggression that maybe is not so helpful in a kind of collaborative context. And then the language we don't use, humility, right? Well, I'm not sure about this, but this is my perspective, rather than just, this is the way it should be, right? Using I language, right? I think that, I'm not sure, but I think this way, but others might disagree, rather than saying this is the truth. Social challenges, right? So the big sort, how we've become segregated politically, we're in our sort of silos, and we don't really have a lot of opportunities, just where we live increasingly, to engage with people who may disagree with us. Urban-rural divides, racial and class divides. And then political challenges. We call affective or emotion-based polarization, where increasingly people are like, don't want their children to marry someone from the opposite party, don't want to engage with them in any way. Substantive policy polarization, our two-party system, our first past the post voting system, gerrymandering, money in politics, all these things, contribute, to this polarization, hyperpartisanship process that makes all of this difficult, right? So it's kind of in the background of this big picture, all this, sort of political, social, rhetorical, psychological challenges. And then, kind of narrowing it down to a couple of things, our sense of capacity. Can we do this? Do we have the ability to reason effectively? Does it, take some training, learning, practice? Do we have the resources? to organize, to set up this kind of, process? Do we have the time? And then those inequities, those inequalities that we were talking about. All of these are pretty substantive, significant challenges. So returning to Micah, can you help us out here a little bit? Right? Is the question. And what I wanted to do was try to kind of map some of these things. It probably won't fit perfectly, but in these three categories that Micah talks about in his book. And this, I want to give credit to one of your pastors, Robert Alexander, who, I don't know if you remember, but about a year ago, I co-hosted a conversation among your pastors about exactly this question. So all 5 of them, talked about their own challenges in talking with family and friends across political divides, right? I think it was right around the election. And we had 2 sessions. I think it may be online somewhere, but I had conversations individually with each of them. And Robert, mentioned, Micah 6:8, which is, if you know it, the sort of the great, often called the great requirement. But to set it up a little bit, sort of the prophet is talking about, so God is saying, look at all this stuff I've done for you. And then the prophet Micah's asking back, well, what do you want? Right? What do you want us to do? And first, he asks these kind of rhetorical questions, like, what these are things that you should not do. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? No. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, love mercy or kindness, and walk humbly with the Lord your God. And this is in the context of, at the beginning of the book, he's kind of blasting away, how bad, the people of Israel and Judah have been, a lot of anger, a lot of, and at injustice, right? A lot of, sort of deep concerns about how the people have been treated. And then it's also, there's these very beautiful visions of the future, right? Of where, the sort of peace, and where we have a different vision of society and heaven, really. But then the question is about, what do we do in the meantime? Where, we have this past we have a problem with, or this future we're working towards. What do we do now? This is his answer, right? I think it's worth repeating. To do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your gods. And just, I did write down some of that future vision of peace. And he shall judge among many people and rebuke strong nations afar off. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Again, how do we get there, right? So these 3 commandments, these 3 requirements, are how to do so. And so, kind of taking each of these in turn. So justice, right? It's a very active thing. It's doing justice. And, in Micah's time, a lot of concerns, and there have been a lot of injustices since then and still happening today. And I'm pulling a little bit from this book book called Making Life Right, Reflections on Micah 6:8 by Tim Dearborn. And he points out, that one of the challenges of thinking about justice is that it's often seen in opposition to mercy, right, to kindness. And that it's seen, sort of in sense of enforcement of the law, right? That's what justice is. It's kind of this hard thing. And, when we, teach ethics, we talk about it as justice as enforceable rights claims, right? There's been a transgression against a right, and we have an ethical responsibility to enforce that transgression. But in the Bible, they're complementary, right? And so he's got a nice reference to the Psalms. Let me see if I can find it. Biblically, justice and mercy embrace. Thus the psalmist pleads, great is your mercy, O Lord. Give me life according to your justice. So it's about, justice is about making life right. And so to adjust things, adjust, or justify, like the margins on in your work, it's the same root, right? It's making things right. And to sort of move away from a sort of like narrow view of it as a kind of legal concept to one that is more relational, not about punishment, but about healing. And we have this idea of restorative justice increasingly, or transformational or transformative justice, in that sense, to sort of get our relationships right? Our relationships with others and with God. And also critically within ourselves. And he makes this distinction between righteousness, sort of internally kind of making things right, and then justice around us. And then moving from, sort of this historical trend that may be replicated in our own minds, that sort of disproportionate retaliation. This is going back to Samson in Judges. I will not stop until I have taken revenge on you, right? So I'm going to really, you did something bad to me, I'm going to do something even worse to you. To a sort of proportionate retribution, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, from Leviticus and Deuteronomy, to more New Testament lens of disproportionate. So we had disproportionate retaliation, we have proportionate retaliation, then we have disproportionate love. And Jesus says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. If you love those who love you, what reward do you have? So, justice, in this sense, is powered, rightly tempered by love. And that's from Tim Dearborn. But I think it's a broadly felt and considered idea. So we can be thinking about, how that conception of justice maybe helps us think about some of this stuff up here, right? We're so concerned, about many issues, from inequalities, orientation toward our particular identity, status quo bias, et cetera, right? Often driven by a concern about justice, right? That, I can't talk to this person. He's so wrong. He's so wrong. She's so off, right? And we're angry. We want that vengeance, really, not necessarily for us, but for others who've been, hurt. But is that really in line with this biblical conception of justice? So let's move, so we can be thinking about this. Let's move to sort of thinking about the mercy, the kindness part. So it's this idea of loving mercy, loving kindness. And here we have, we talk about sort of God as kind, as embodying kindness. And really interesting, sort of thinking about linguistically, the root of the Hebrew word for mercy is related to the word womb, right? Womb. And like a womb, here he says, mercy involves sacrifice, hospitality, discomfort, and even risk. And making the connection to Jesus, Jesus stooped down and took the risk, so to speak, of bearing our wounded human flesh. He carried it into his own womb of mercy, where could be healed, redeemed, and recreated. And so this idea of a womb as a space of mercy, of kindness, I find very powerful because it connects to some of the stuff we're trying to do with deliberative citizenship, creating spaces. When we walk the way of justice, mercy, and humility, we courageously participate in God creating safe spaces in which people's lives can be made right by mercy. Mercy creates communities where all life can be protected and nourished. And so not thinking, of life, of politics as a courtroom, of judgment, but one of a space of love. And he gives us this really powerful story of Dorothy, a World Vision staff member in Rwanda, who during the genocide, she's in her house and someone came into her house and dragged her son outside and killed him with a machete in her front yard, right in front of her. But every day she prayed for her son's murderer and for all the victims and perpetrators. And a decade later, a decade after the genocide, there was a furtive knock on Dorothy's door. She opened it, and who should be there but the man who had killed her son? He said, "I've come here that justice would be done. I killed many people during those 100 days, but for 10 years, I've not been able to get the face of your son out of my mind. So I'm here for you to take me to the police and let justice be done." Dorothy opened her door wider and pulled the man inside her home. She said to him, "Young man, justice will be done. You took away my son. You shall now be to me as a son." So Christ draws us into the womb of God's love to renew, recreate, and restore us. So we all have incredible injustice. Can't imagine, though, a more greater injustice. And yet, look what Dorothy does. So we think about all this and all the injustices we're facing in the world, but what is the right response to it, right? Is it to slap the person back, or is it to turn the other cheek and to welcome them into that conversation? So that brings us to our third part of the great requirement, humility. And here, I'm just going to quote some other parts of the Bible to help us get a sense of what humility is, right? So first from Philippians 2:3-11. "Do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men." Proverbs 11:12. "When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble is wisdom." Jeremiah 9:23. "Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom, let not the mighty man boast in his might, let not the rich man boast in his riches." And then Peter, 1 Peter 5:5. "Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." So what are you hearing in these verses about humility? What is sort of a kind of a trend or theme cross-cutting each of them? Yeah.
I'm just struck with that womb image. And I just think it just changes the landscape if you can imagine a safe place. And so much of what we have up there, I they don't envision a safe place.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's just an important fascinating image.
Yeah, so connecting to how do we create that safe place? The answer, I think, is in partially, not completely, partially in this language of humility, right? At some point, Tim Dearborn says humility connects justice and mercy and kindness. Because what does it do? It puts us in a position, a mindset, a disposition that is different, right? It's not ego-based. It's one of not pride, right? Of wisdom and awareness of our own limitations. And critically, though, humility is not necessarily self-doubt, self-effacement, self-hate, right? There's a balance between, too much pride and too much humility, right? You need to be able to step in this space and be able to represent yourself, express your own positions, but in a humble, in an open-minded, in a caring and kind way.
It's love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How would you like to be treated in that space, in that room, in a sense? And then Dearborn also talks about, what is literally the language, right, from 6:8, that we walk humbly with our Lord. Walking, right? What is, what does that mean? What does that help us with? And he says sort of three things: walking receptively, being open, right, to different perspectives, open to God's wisdom, love, walking silently, and this goes to whoever said up here, not listening, right? If you're talking, you're literally not listening. So you have to be silent, right? And that requires some humility, that you don't have all the answers. If you have all the answers, you should talk the whole time, right? And then third, walking courageously, right? It's hard to do that. It's hard often to step into that space. And then doing it everywhere and all the time. It's not necessarily just when you walk into a deliberation, this is a nice DCI organized thing, I'm gonna be really good here, but then I'm gonna go over here and be, back to my own self, right? Back to my ego, back to my pride. And keeping track, well, he wasn't that way, she wasn't that way. That's not what Jesus was doing, right? So, where does this leave us? Almost perfect timing, hopefully. If we think about these three requirements: to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with the Lord. There's a nice quote in here that I can find quickly. In order to do justice God's way, we can't separate justice from mercy and humility. Justice by itself, up in the corner, up in the top, can make us seem tough and uncompromising. Mercy by itself can make us seem soft and sentimental and blind us to the causes of injustice. Humility by itself, and this is the sense of being too humble or self-effacing, can leave us trampled on and exploited by others. Making life right requires living all three dimensions of God's great requirement: doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God. Because again, justice is power rightly ordered by love. It's something we do, or miraculously something in which we participate. It's our way of life as we live with the God who loves justice. So this picture, I think, is interesting, right? So, and we can map a lot of these concerns that we've just talked to, maybe not all of them exactly, but a lot of them, to these things. So justice by itself, can't talk to him. I want action. I want justice right away. I don't have time for this deliberation stuff. A sort of sense of I can't do this. This is too hard, right? I don't have the ability to deliberate. That humility, too much humility, right? And a sense of impatience, and even maybe, kind of thinking about vices, sloth, like laziness, like it's not, I just want to do this right now. Well, it takes that courage, right? That humility, that walking courageously to step into that room. And then again, I already know all the answers. I know what the right answer is. What do I need to do this for? I don't need to hear these different perspectives. That doesn't sound very humble. And so these things can pull us in different directions, but we can see that middle point, right? And for people online, right in there where it intersects as a sort of, maybe I'll draw it on the board for people online to be able to see. So right, justice, humility, and mercy. And this little space here as a window by which we can get there, right? As a pathway, right? To help us resolve these things. And it starts with these dispositions, right? Having deliberative dispositions. The Davidson, we talk about humane instincts, right? Leaning into those instincts, leaning into those dispositions. It's not enough, right? But it's necessary. Now, next time we'll talk about what else we need to resolve some of these issues. For example, clear rules, right? No matter how much disposition you have, right? If you don't have the good rules, it's also going to fail, right? If you don't have a way to deal with facts and inequalities, it's going to also fail. But it's also going to fail if you've got all that stuff and you don't have this. If you haven't come into, and that you haven't encouraged others to come into the space with that perspective, right? And we've framed it as a religious, as a Christian kind of context today, but I would argue that this is a kind of universal idea, right? Across faith traditions, across secular traditions, humanistic perspectives. And the more we can figure this out, right, the better we'll be able to do all the rest. Which next week we will talk, as I said, about the how, the technical sort of aspects of deliberative citizenship, deliberative democracy, and deliberation that we can all do, in our daily lives and to encourage in our general politics. So thank you all, and I look forward to talking more with you next time. And yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Hey, yeah, good to see you. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for coming. I mean, very good, very good. The kids are getting bigger. Do you want to turn this off? Yeah, they're getting bigger. So Jordan is now 7 years old, and Asher is 4, and they're growing every day. So yeah. How have you been? Yeah, and John? Yeah. I haven't seen either of you obviously in a while. So yeah.